All right, so welcome everybody to the Equity and Inclusion Critical Conversation Series. My name is Eric Johnson, and I'm the Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion for faculty and staff at WSU in the College of Education. And we, as part of the initiative that the Equity and Inclusion Committee had for this year, was to support these presentations that we're calling critical conversations around equity and inclusion. And this is the fourth installment. And so the previous three have been absolutely fantastic. We have them housed on our website, which you don't want to see Zoom, I'm assuming. So if you go to WSU College of Education Equity and Inclusion Committee, it lands you to our page with multiple resources, but down below we have a space where we're going to be posting these. This is the third one, but after all four of them, we'll have the four of them there. And so I encourage anybody that sees this to go ahead and click on those and forward them to anyone who might be interested. Now, today we were really excited when we reviewed this proposal because, and I'll let Jessica and Imran introduce themselves. But we also have two different colleges represented. And so that makes it, I think, the conversation even more applicable instead of just focusing in on, what's going on in the College of Education. So, but yeah, so keep tuned. We're going to have hopefully 4 more next year. And with that, Jessica, go ahead and Imran, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Eric. And thanks everyone for showing up. It's a small group, but it's a mighty group. And I'm super excited about having some conversations. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you all. All right, so the title of our critical conversation today is "Where Are You From? Interrogating Exclusion in Public Spaces." And I think the seeds of this were born when Imran and I actually were part of the LIFT program, which is it's for faculty across all WSU campuses, and the idea is to improve teaching and learning across our campuses. And Imran and I had the pleasure, we drove to Tri-Cities. It was just the two of us. So we talked all 4 hours over there. We talked all 4 hours back. And we realized that we had just a lot of experiences in common, even though our backgrounds are different. And so that was kind of the idea. This is a question that we're asked a lot, or variations therein. And so the purpose of our time today is to really think about kind of the roots and the ideological roots of questions like, where are you from, or what are you? So to begin with, I wanted to start with a land acknowledgement, and I encourage you, wherever you are, because I know we're coming to this webinar from various places, if you know the tribes, bands, peoples that inhabit your particular reach, whether you're in Oregon, as I think Imran is, or in Washington, go ahead and drop those names in the chat. I'm sharing with you here the land acknowledgement for WSU Vancouver specifically. We are the traditional homelands of the Cowlitz Indian tribe and the peoples of the Lower Columbia Valley. I also, if you might notice, there are some QR codes on the right-hand side here. And as we know, we know that land acknowledgements can run the risk of really remaining just kind of performative, right? When we kind of read this statement that has been vetted by a million people. And I want to note that I know our Vancouver statement has been written in conjunction with Indigenous tribal leaders. So it is a really strong, I think, piece of acknowledgement. However, we also know that they're supposed to spur us to action, right? They remain performative if we sit back and do nothing. And so to that end, what I have done here, and I'm going to go ahead and pause, is I've just created a few little QR codes here that lead to kind of different actions that you can take. And we'll actually pause the whole thing right now so you can potentially choose an action. So we have, these are all also like germane to either Washington or where I am specifically in kind of the Portland metro area. So we have a petition for the recognition of the Duwamish tribe in the Seattle area. There's the Potlatch Fund. There's the NAYA, it's the Native American Youth and Family Center that's out of Portland. And also the Native Organizers Alliance, which is a nonprofit that seeks to just burnish the leadership skills of Native folks, like to get initiatives off the ground. So I'm gonna sit for just a few minutes right now. I invite you to read the land acknowledgement in full and or maybe use the QR codes from one of these organizations and think about maybe taking an action. Maybe take about 15 more seconds. I know that's not enough time potentially to go through all of them, but maybe enough time to latch onto one. Great. Thank you all so much for engaging in any way that you were able to engage today. Um, I want to quickly talk about our agenda. It's pretty loose, it's pretty open. We're hoping to have some really good conversations with this group. So we'll start off with some introductions. Imran and I will share a little bit more about our stories. Then we'll get into talking about this idea of caste and how that plays into sort of the exclusionary roots of questions like, where are you from? And then we'll talk about how to lead through belonging. So how to kind of interrupt or kind of think differently about interactions in which a question like, where are you from, might come up. Turn it over to Imran.
Yeah, I like to get to know people and when I first meet them. And one of the questions I like to ask is just, what did you clear in your taxes? And, that kind of gets the conversation started, right? No uncomfortable, awkward pauses or any type of feelings that would make you feel like that's an inappropriate question to ask in the first 5 minutes you meet someone. But that's obviously not a traditional, I would say, way to get to know somebody, right? Is how much money you make this month or this year. And um, even with our closest friends and our family, I mean, my parents and my siblings, we don't really exchange at Thanksgiving table what we cleared on our taxes last year, right? Maybe you do with your families. So that question is a pretty good example of something that's close, borderline intrusive, super personal to your core. And so I think the parallel I try to make when we talk about this, when we're discussing this topic, it's people think it's a pretty harmless way to get to know somebody when you're asking this question, where are you from? And then we can dig into how do you approach getting to know other people? How do you connect with them? what is your natural sort of tendency there. And it really depends, right? There's lots of layers. Would depend on if they're a native English speaker. It would depend on what their skin color might be. It would depend on their first, middle, or last name and how you perceive that as being status quo, normal or not, which we could get into as well. But so the where are you from question often is posed to somebody with the name Imran, or somebody who's a non-native English speaker who was an exchange or international student on your high school campus or your college campus. And those people probably face that question in abundance, right? Wouldn't you think that an international student would have to answer that question quite frequently? And then the next thing I would ask people is, why do you ask that question? What is your motivation for asking where are you from? And most of the time, it's somebody who possibly was born here, native English speaker, who's asking someone else, where are you from? And when I ask that question, typically I'm just curious. And then I chuckle a little bit because, being just curious is great. And I think it's important because we should be curious about others in an interpersonal way, in a meaningful way, in a detailed way. We should want to get to know other people in this world. However, then I ask another follow-up question, which is, if you're just curious about that person who's an international exchange student, do you ask that question to everybody you meet? So I will put Eric on the spot. Eric, do you get asked frequently, where are you from and where were you born? Eric, you're muted.
Jokes are always much funnier with the mic on. That's what I tell students. That's interesting. Just in normal conversations with people, if I'm speaking English, no. But if
Yeah,
I speak Spanish, that's like
Spanish.
the first thing they ask.
Very good. Very
Yeah.
good. Excellent example. Gosh, I'm glad I called on you. So I think what I try to really sort of ruffle feathers can be ruffled. It really, what I'm trying to dig into when I get into this topic is, if you're just curious, then let's take, for example, the lens of just being curious. If you lined up 50 people in front of you, and no matter what their skin color or their accent or not, or their socioeconomic background, if you're it should either be everybody or none, because we aren't really at liberty to cherry pick. So the I'm just curious typically corresponds with a name like Imran, or somebody who's speaking in a different language like Eric said, or somebody who has a non-native accent. Those people are typically cherry picked to the I'm just curious, where are you from? Like I don't mean any harm by it, right? So the problem with that is that it creates complex displacement to our population. So people who are non-native English speakers, people who do have different skin color than, what we'll get into in a minute, are oftentimes sort of interrogated by others and saying, you have to answer this question now. We want to know where you're born. We want to know your story of when you immigrated here, your parents, your grandparents did. We only want to know from you. We don't really care about all these people, all these other people over here who speak fluent English or are in these other categories. So then in my classes that I've taught, I've been lucky enough to teach at the college level for 15 years. I think it's this sort of history lesson of, where does this question come from and why is it important to sort of, put it in perspective to the United States lens, the United States environment, the United States population. We have 300 plus million people that live in this country, and Jessica and I were talking about this, and almost all of us have something in common. We're products of immigration, right? So no matter if you believe in religion or science or whatever you believe in that started the world's population, things started to colonize and communities began to reproduce and create in North Africa, Middle East area, right? And then from there we had movement, and that movement was on dry land. But eventually people somehow got the courage to say, hey, there's stuff over there. So they went to different continents, and one of those was the USA, right? North America. And so what we find is that people don't associate themselves with being products of immigration, although an extremely high percentage of our population is just that. Either you, your generation, your parents, your grandparents, great grandparents, I don't care, came from a different part of the world and have now started a life in the United States or continued to repopulate generations. So then I've met people who say, you know, kind of are territorial and super patriotic and are like, this is my country and I want to control who comes in and who leaves and all this stuff, and they want to be in charge. And then I say, well, if you want to make the argument who was here first should be in charge, then who wins that argument? And then we just get, it's really awkward at that point, because it's like, oh no, you're right, the people who are here first, well, I guess, yeah, you're right, but we were here in abundance and we came from the European countries. And so you get into this sort of positioning in this competition of, are you more valuable, are we valuing people who are from Europe more than Africa or Asia, which are the most common places that you'll see populations in the United States. And so geographic origin is ethnicity, right? So you create your belongingness through ethnicity, and you identify your ethnicity as your geographic origin from no matter what you are. So again, I'll put Eric on the spot because Eric's great and he's a dean and he's highly educated and brilliant. So I'm just going to pick on him. But if you did the 23andMe test, the DNA test, you would have probably some breakdown percentage of different strands of DNA in different places that make you biologically who you are, right? And then say, for example, do you know what your ethnicity is? Do you know, since we're on the topic, but you can just humor us.
So on my mom's side, there are these records that traveling, immigrating from France and Northern Europe through Canada, down into Montana. And my dad's side, my would-be grandpa was a bootlegger, and so he bailed out of Oklahoma, changed his last name, and so it's like this mystery of we really found out that my dad's grandma was like full Cherokee, but anyway.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so these are all awesome points to explore, especially with the 23andMe, where countries contribute that material or more represented versus those who don't. And so so people can say, I'm not from Africa. Well, you are, like, originally. So,
hypothetically, Eric, if you say you had 42% was from Norway and 30% was from Germany and another percentage is broken brown, you could still determine that the highest percentage of your DNA was from Norway, but you still feel like your ethnicity and your heart and your belongingness of your identity is German, even though it's a smaller percentage than the big biological percentage, and you can determine that. So the reason I'm trying to throw that out there is because that's a process that we create through our social belongingness. And it still comes back to the point of people who have ethnicities that typically are from Europe don't have to discuss those as much. Like they're less discussed, less asked. And so we get back into the territorial who originated this land, who's in charge, and then that creates the power dynamic for having the courage to ask that question. And then the last thing I say before we move to the next slide is, I told my students this for years, and I said, when I thought about this, when we would have this conversation in my classes, I'd say, what occurred to me? I've never asked that question to somebody in the first 5 minutes I meet them. I just never felt like it was my, right to ask to have that information. And so what's interesting about it is that maybe that's because I'm from a minoritized background. I don't know, but I would just think that it would be sort of a very intrusive question. And so what people don't really understand, because it's coming from maybe my lived experience, is that it is as intimate as asking my income. Like it's really close information for me to dig into, like why my dad came here in the 60s and why he was the youngest of 10 children to get on a boat. And, like all these things, I'm like, why am I telling this stranger all this stuff about my family right now? Why am I disclosing that? Because they've asked me in a way that makes me feel like I want them to approve of my belongingness in the United States as a first-born immigrant, right? So that's kind of where we get into this conversation of why it could be considered an exclusionary act, to give you some sort of kind of a preface to the conversation. I think we can go to the next slide. The next one's us sort of introducing. No, okay. Goals. There we go. Go ahead, Jessica.
No, this is all great. Yeah, so we have two very broad goals. I mean, essentially, like we hope that everyone on this call, like ourselves certainly included, will just kind of have some maybe time, space, maybe some inspiration to think about our own positionality and our own relationship to that question. Like, where are you from? What are you, etc. And we want to talk about how to engage in conversations, first of all, in ways to like noticeably like omit those kinds of questions and like kind of hold our own kind of stop ourselves from like the need to like ask that question when we spot difference. But then also ways to like interrupt and disrupt when we see this kind of othering happening in maybe public spaces that we frequent, whatever our positions are. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about ourselves. We'll answer those questions for you on the front end, just to give you some context. So I'll start first. My name is Jessica Masterson. I'm an assistant professor of teaching and learning on the Vancouver campus of WSU. In terms of my background, I have a mixed racial background. So my mom and her family, they are Chicane, which is basically Mexican Americans. Kind of, it's kind of a political term, kind of an old school term, but Chicano, Chicana, Chicane, that all means kind of like people with Mexican heritage, born in the US, often very centered around kind of, I'm thinking like California, Southwest, Arizona, etc., Texas. And my dad is from an Irish and German background. And I mean, all of this means that, I exist in the world often as a racially ambiguous person. I recognize that in a lot of spaces, I have white privilege, but that's always conditional, right? Because race, as we know, and as we will discuss, like, is a social construct, which means that it's kind of up to other people to decide what your race is, right? I mean, you can say it, you can say like, this is how I identify, but when the rubber meets the road, right? When I'm walking down the street, when I'm in particular areas, people will read me in different ways, right? And they will respond to me in those different ways. So it's an interesting position to kind of note that I do have light skin privilege in a lot of places, but also to watch out for places where I don't. I grew up working class in a very rural community in Southern Oregon, which I think also really influenced kind of the way that I see the world. It was a predominantly white community, very, very conservative. So I felt a lot of kind of layers of difference as a result of that. I'm the first woman in my family to graduate from college, which is, just a huge milestone, and many people have followed. I was just thinking like, oh, I think we have like 4 or 5 women now who've graduated from college in our family, which is really cool. I also identify as cisgender and queer. So kind of all of these things together sort of make up who I am and how I move through the world. And in terms of my motivation for this work, both, my research with WSU, but also for having conversations like this, I'm constantly trying to recognize my areas of privilege and use those areas and spaces to advocate on behalf of minoritized folks. And I also think a lot about working with and creating spaces and schools that are more hospitable for minoritized teachers. That's another kind of passion project of mine. We know that teachers of color just have an immensely positive impact on their students of color, but also on all students, and they are woefully underrepresented. So I'm thinking about kind of race, class, socioeconomic status, sexuality, et cetera. Also in terms of like, how do we disrupt schools, which are really like middle class, heteronormative white spaces, right? And also, I am super interested in complicating our understanding of race. I think I'm going to go out on a limb, but I think on this call, right, we have had conversations about race. We're not new to necessarily talking or thinking about it, but I'm hoping that through kind of talking about this book and sort of this new framework, maybe we can start to problematize and complicate this idea of race. So I want to talk briefly about this photo that's here. So when I was in college, I was part of this fellowship program, and because I was part of this fellowship program, which was for students of color who wanted to be professors, I was in Minnesota at the time, and the Minnesota Museum of Science originated in conjunction with the American Anthropological Association an exhibit on race, and it was called Race, Are We So Different? So this is like 2005, maybe 2006. It was a minute ago. And as part of that exhibit, they had everyone in this fellowship program. They kind of talked to us, they learned about our histories, and then they created unique t-shirts for all of us that told like what we would be, what our census category would be over time. So you can see mine. I'm kind of gesturing to myself because I happened upon this exhibition. It's still out in the world. I was in San Diego in January of 2023, and there it was at one of their museums in Balboa Park. So there's me as a little baby. And as you can see, right, in 1930, I would have been classified as Mexican. In 1950, I would have been considered white. In 1990, Hispanic white. And you can kind of see from the other folks around me, my other fellowship members, that the whole point here is that like, this is made up, right? Like none of these categories hold, none of these categories, are fixed, right? And so I think also informs a whole lot about how I approach the work that I do, right? Like, even though identities can be really helpful and can be meaningful in terms of like answering questions about who we are, like who am I in this big world, ultimately they are human constructions, right? And therefore they can be changed and they will change. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
So Jessica, let me hop in real quick. I put
Yeah.
the link in the chat to that. So my background's in anthro, and so I put the link to the main home page for the race project. It has tons of really good resources for teaching or professional development. So I encourage anybody that's interested in that to go to, just if you type AAA, it's American Anthropological Association Race Project, it'll take you right there, and it's fantastic. I'm so happy that you were part of that. That's great.
Yeah, if you see it out there, I'm also a talking head in one of the videos. It was such a trip to come back to this, almost 2 decades later. But thanks for the link, Eric.
You should have told me. I just went to San Diego. I would have looked it up. Okay. So my background, it's tough act to follow. Jessica's just, goodness gracious. But I was just going to talk a little bit about, obviously, growing up in Oregon, being a native I think in my hometown, I think it was like less than 1% were not, maybe 2% were not Caucasian. And I think that just sort of paints the picture of kind of some of the challenges that I face. And I put sports in there because I don't know, it's weird. I have this special connection to sports, and and maybe it does have something to do with it, maybe it doesn't, but I was on a podcast the other day talking about how it's the one place that I could go as a kid or anyone could go, where it didn't matter what your name was or what your religion was or how much money you made, because it was sort of just all about like, teamwork and camaraderie and chemistry and working with others and competing. And, that was just an environment that I always loved, no matter what sport it was that I was playing. So I did grow up playing sports, which is a part of my identity, and it was a great part of my identity, mostly. And then, I'm lucky enough to have been teaching at the college level for a long time, and at 5 different schools, and I've been at Washington State for 4 years now, and I'm a scholarly assistant professor for the Merle College of Communication. And of course, my kids are in the picture there. That's the Enzo on the left and Rafa on the right, and they're why I do everything. I mean, I think it's cliche, but having kids is something, I don't know how to really articulate this, but you think about it and you can't prepare for it or understand what it's going to feel like until it happens. And so when it happened, my entire world changed, which anyone on the call who has kids, it's just my motivation when I get up out of bed in the morning, the underlying, I think, some subconscious motivation for me to put 2 feet out of bed is for them, so what I'm doing in my professional or personal time, if it can help my kiddos to have a more you know, successful or valuable future, then I'm going to try to do it. And I think part of this work, these conversations that we have that are less discussed and can be sometimes uncomfortable, will help with that, because both of my kids will have to check mark a box that doesn't exist on a government form, which is like, I checked mark other growing up, and it was not the funnest box for me to check mark, to be honest, because I was always the other, and then I started check marking Asian, and then I would show up to job interviews, and I think people were like, this guy's not Chinese, what the hell's going on? And so my kids will have to check mark something that's different because they're Pakistani and they're European. And so again, we get into this whole situation where, and Jessica and I will talk about it later, where we're not really doing a very good job of figuring out how we can classify different groups and things like that. So other than my kids being my motivation, I grew up, I'm not going to give you this long sob story, but I think personal motivation is that when I grew up, I grew up pre 9/11 high school years, but back then it was more about just being told to go back to my country, or being teased about my name or my religion, or my immigration status and things like that. And there was definitely just a power dynamic between me and other people at my high school, for example, where they felt like they had more belongingness to this country than I did. And I was convinced of that. Like, just to be completely transparent, like, I was in my brain convinced that I was lucky to be accepted here and live here and not be shipped back to where, they said I came from. And so I think that that's one of my motivations for wanting to talk about this openly, is that I was that kid who believed that I didn't have a place here, and then people were kind of making a place for me and allowing me to have a spot at the table, metaphorical spot at the table. So I think that's where I get both of my motivations for wanting to kind of be here today, I guess, is kind of what we're talking about. So yeah, we can go to the next slide, Jessica. I don't remember what it is, but it's something good. All right. So do you want to go ahead?
You go ahead. You
Okay.
keep the ball.
So the one thing I just mentioned, and I think if anyone shows this video, or if Eric shares it somewhere, or this watched in a class, I think what I really try to key in on, and as an educator, is what I've personally immersed myself in research wise, but also in my classroom research, to analyze race versus ethnicity. And I was in a meeting not too long ago with the district attorney where I live, and the reason why I'm telling you that is recent, but what makes that conversation relevant here is because there are arrest and sentencing statistics in Oregon, where I live, that are not accurate, because we are not classifying race and that, but they don't know what they're doing. The people at the top who have made the system are doing it wrong, right? So I'll give you my breakdown, and I'll give you the example. The breakdown is race, like Jessica said, is a socially constructed category, but another way to look at race is that it's typically referred to as race, but really people mean racial characteristics. So if we really going to get it right, let's just say racial characteristics, and everybody's like, well, no, that's not it. And I'm like, yeah, it is, because race is just one category. It's all humans. I hate to break it to you, we're all the same, but we have categories of skin color, eye color, hair color, bone structure, height, weight. And those are differentiating features. So if we wanted to get really precise and do it right, we would have you fill out a declaration sheet on a government form or a job form and just say, this is what I look like. Okay, boom, done. The ethnicity portion we already talked about, and that's geographic origin, which is, again, created by your belongingness to that identity or that group, no matter what it is. And you can identify that yourself in an open box. We don't want to have this, and I can talk about in a minute the different examples, but not all Black people are from Africa. I know this is groundbreaking stuff. Not all Black people are from Africa. Not all Asians are from China, and I can go on and on. So when somebody says they're Black on a form, they check mark Black, and they come into the room, and you meet them, and you're interviewing them to be in your school or at your internship or for your job. And then you find out that they're from Fiji, or they're from Australia or somewhere else. And you're like, what's going on here? How is this possible? It's because you've gotten it wrong. They can check mark what they look like, and they can check mark geographic origin, or we can describe them in detail because we care about the details and it matters. And then we can start to make progress. So again, going back to my example, arrests and sentencing have a discrepancy because at some point somebody lobbied to make Mexican white. So now what's happening is that there was a time frame where they said there are not bias crimes or arrests happening because whites are being arrested and prosecuted longer. And then, but in the fine print, it was they're actually Mexican are being grouped with Caucasian, white, European. So you see how they're not getting that right. If we were going to go by ethnicity, we could really learn more about arrest rates, sentencing, when you get into a courtroom and somebody identifies you in 3D and says, oh, this person is Black or Mexican or Pakistani. They're more of a threat to society than this person who has lighter skin. And that now changes, right? What we're talking about, the racial characteristics and geographic origin. So that's kind of why we try to differentiate the importance of that. And then belongingness, I think, is the other one I'm going to talk about in the quadrant. And in all these presentations that I give, belongingness, I say my one line is that it's cheesy, but it's important. And belongingness, a lot of people argue is for kindergartners, but it's not. It's for everybody. And I think the reason why there needs to be a focus on it is because we can see that there are challenges in our culture, in our country, that lead to substance abuse, lead to violence, lead to other areas. And typically those can come from feeling excluded, feeling like you don't belong, wanting to act on those feelings in not the most productive way. And again, not enough people have the ability, or there's just not enough people out there that can provide therapy to a lot of people that need it. And so the belongingness has to be a process from the time that somebody is young until they're in adulthood. And it's an important part of being a better employee, being a better student, being a better friend, being a better romantic partner, and I could go down that list too. So the belongingness aspect for me personally is that I always felt like I was a person who got invited to the fancy dinner that was given like a sort of a pass, and I got into the dinner and I was hoping that my pass wouldn't expire or something like that. And so my belongingness was kind of like tentative, and there wasn't anybody who looked at me when I was 14 years old and said, Imran, everybody's a product of immigration, and there's no one person that's in charge here, and they don't have more ability or belongingness or right to be here than you do. And if anyone tells you different, then they're wrong. And no one said that to me. So the lack of belongingness that I felt for many years was a result of misinformation, and it caused a lot of doubt and a lot of lack of confidence. And then I had fear of entering rooms with new people because I didn't want to go through the steps of what Jessica and I talked about earlier, which is, where are you from, Imran? Where's your name come from? When did your parents immigrate here? So I went through this vicious cycle of feeling social anxiety and not wanting to get into deep conversations with people because I would, fingers crossed, be like, oh man, I hope they don't ask me my religion. I hope they don't ask me my origin of my name. I hope they don't ask me when my parents decided to immigrate here. And so there was a lot of different things working against me, including job markets, including social situations, and so on. So I'll let Jessica take it from here with identity and ethnocentrism.
And I just want to piggyback on that. Sorry to interrupt, but your notion of belonging not being cheesy, that's absolutely like foundational to understand. I put a resource in the chat here. It's a book titled Belonging Through a Culture of Dignity. And so I highly recommend anybody interested in that concept. I mean, that's the next step in the equity and inclusion movement, is the notion of belonging. So thank you for mentioning that, Imran.
And thank you so much, Eric, for throwing resources in the chat. I love it. The other two key terms that we want to kind of like throw out there just to kind of put into the ether today to be thinking about are, first of all, identity, which is a huge and slippery concept. really loosely defined, it comprises both like how we see ourselves. So perhaps like our physical qualities or our personality traits, beliefs, expressions. It also encompasses our connections to and memberships to various groups, right? That's part of our identity. It can also be informed by our awareness of how we're viewed by others, right? So I think about, for instance, like the phenomenon of machismo, right, which is kind of this hyper masculinity associated with Latinx men. So something that I'm familiar with, something like I have seen, right, within my own family, and you know, not all of that, but certainly a part of that. And I think I have to credit Gloria Ansaldúa for kind of bringing this to my attention. Is like some of that is a response to essentially being so marginalized by white society, right? Kind of quote unquote feminized. And of course, there's a lot of sexism built into that itself, right? But I'm just putting out there that our identity can also be shaped by just kind of like how as a group we're treated, how as individually like we're treated by others based on some of those characteristics. And then the final term is just thinking about ethnocentrism, right? So using our own cultural framework as kind of the bar to which every other cultural group is judged, seeing our own cultural group as like the norm, right? That's literally kind of centering your own ethnicity, right? Which then which closes us off to other ways of being that are just as valid, right? I don't know about you, Imran. I'm wondering if like maybe we should kind of pause right here. We've been doing a lot of sharing.
I like it.
So, okay, yeah. I'm wondering kind of before we get into more of the meat of, thinking about caste and thinking about how caste shows up in questions like, where are you from? I would love to invite folks to share, either just like kind of unmute and jump in or put into the chat. I'd love to know like your relationship to questions like, what are you, or where are you from? What is like your personal relationship to that question? And again, you don't have to answer the question, just like, how does it show up for you in your life, if at
Great
all?
idea. Great idea.
I'd be happy to go ahead. So I am originally from Taiwan and I came as an international student. So for the longest time, it makes sense. Yeah, I'm not from here. And then I do have like a location where I sail from. And so to me, it's an authentic experience, or that I didn't feel like I was excluded or alienized in a way. But as I grew and I realized why does it matter to you? Why does it matter that I speak really great English or and slowly became because I look different. And so and then I think my perspective changed, and then I think my reaction went from, oh, it's no big deal and welcoming, to feeling that, okay, you are trying to get at something, and that is, I don't think that's exactly, you're asking me something that you you don't want to know, right?
Yeah.
And so I started kind of avoiding that question, or when people ask, I would stop and I would think, it's like, okay, what are you trying to ask? I would actually ask them back, like, what are you trying to find out? Is it where I was born, my ethnicity, my experience? Like, what exactly that you want to find out?
I love it.
And that sometimes I hope it's a positive experience for folks who ask me those questions. And it became like, oh, I want to know like your experience or your life or something like that. And I just don't know not the right way, but the more appropriate way to ask. And then I start asking people, say, in the future, if you want to ask me about my heritage. You're welcome to ask me about my heritage, because I've been happy to share that, my culture, what I like live, but
Yeah.
right, not that I was born. I mean, my mother gave birth to me, if that's helpful.
Yeah.
Right. So that was my experience and how it changes over time.
So just to respond to you, I think thanks a lot for sharing. That's just such great input. But I think, was this happening to you like in the first stage of meeting somebody? Like, was this like an initial conversation like I've been describing?
Yeah. In the past, I think it was a lot more often. I think my social group definitely shrunk a lot after pandemic. And then I've been located in Pullman, so I have a very close-knit friends. So haven't really had a lot of exposure to folks who might not be familiar with who I am.
Right.
But yeah, I think at the beginning, a lot of times like, where are you from?
Right.
Was the first question that would come out.
Yeah.
And then when they find out, oh, you're from Taiwan, you speak really good English, is the
Yeah.
second comment that's usually come out.
And they think that that would make it better. And I think I'm so glad you shared, because, you know, you're a stronger person than I, because I think it took me a while well into my 30s to grow my big adult muscles and push back. But I think people were like, they could ask about my heritage, they could ask about my, you know, anything background wise, and I still would argue against it because it's so personal. And I'd almost want to say like, well, do you want to get to know me first, and like what kind of hobbies and interests and sports and movies and music and TV shows I like, before we start talking about like my sexual orientation and stuff? Do you want to get into that first, you know? Because I think that's where it's a lose-lose situation for somebody like you and me, Rebecca, because they walk away going like, man, that immigrant guy who's from Pakistan, he was rude, and man, those people are coming into our country and they're just rude, you know? And like, then this one tiny sliver of the pizza gets ripped out and says, that's what everybody's like who's Muslim, that's what everybody's like who's Pakistani. And I think, so I kind of wanted to pick your brain on, you know, how do you feel like you could push back in a way, or do you think it's possible to push back and say, no, I actually don't want to, you know, I've talked about it a lot with people, and I don't know that I have the perfect solution of like saying, let's not talk about my life story and where my ancestors were from, and the, you know, do you think, is there been a situation where you feel like it was articulated, discussed, like were you able to escape it and feel like it was kind of smooth and it didn't ruffle any feathers? And go ahead if you have.
Sadly, no. My most recent experience was where are you from? And I became very aware, and also I'm 37, and so I appear young, genetics hopefully. But then in right terms of, there's a lot of like, you know, anyway. So was it when the question come out, I do stop, right? It does take me back a moment. Like, are you asking me because you want to know where I've, like, maybe like in the States? Are you asking me because like you might be from a different state or city, because Pullman, why what ended up in Pullman? Right? So like I ask people sometimes like, so before Pullman, where were you? It's like, what bring you to Pullman? So like that is, I mean, like from my perspective. And so like sometimes the feeling of like, I'm trying to figure out like, what exactly are you trying to ask? I think in the perfect world, when the question comes up, it is truly trying to say, this person is trying to connect. They're very curious because we obviously do not look like them. And so I can see in terms of that curiosity as a human being. But then I'm hoping like, if I'm having the energy and time and preparation to kind of, you know, like pull out a card when I see the situation happen, is to ask like, what do you want to find out? Like, obviously you're trying to connect with me. Tell me more about you. Like, where are you from? And then but then is that because I'm a bigger person, or is because my ethnicity and my gender forces me to be nice?
Right. No, that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, I'm glad you were able to share. That's awesome. Aaron, anything, or Natalia? I don't know if Natalia's at the desk, but either one would be great.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so Jessica's my sister, so her family is my family, her parents are my parents. Our genetics are fairly similar. But I know that for me, because I also grew up in a really small school, different part of Oregon, but still a really small part of Oregon. And I know that the question, what are you, is just like so prevalent. And as a kid, I've always been kind of more like argumentative. I think Jessica can corroborate that. Confrontational. And so I think once I realized that what people were asking is kind of trying to pinpoint my differences, like why is your skin that color? Why is your hair that color? Why is it a different texture than mine? Why is it, you know, what have you? And people would ask, you know, like, what are you? My response, as Jessica mentioned, her dad is Irish. And so I would just say Irish, because you could just see people's confusion. They're not satisfied with that answer, right? Like they're like, no, that's a level of whiteness. That's not what I'm seeing in you. What is it? And then I would just stick to that. And then people, like, you could just, I think I really enjoyed seeing people's faces just be so like unsatisfied. Like that is not what they were trying to ask, but I think in that moment also realized that maybe it wasn't an appropriate question. So rather than double down or continue to, oh yeah. So I was like, point, I'm an Aries, yeah.
Oh, I love it. I love it. I love hearing all of this.
Yeah. So I think that's always been my response. But I think that those questions are really invasive, and seldom is someone, in my experience, asking me like, oh, what part of Oregon are you from? Oh, I'm from that town too. It's always like, okay, well, if you're from Oregon, where are your parents from?
Yeah.
Or your grandparents from?
Yeah.
Until they get that answer.
Yeah.
And luckily in my adult life, I got to move out of the tiny town and went to some places where I think people maybe are a little bit more aware of those things.
Sure.
So I've not been asked that question in a little while, but this is a really interesting conversation.
No, I want to just offer one more anecdote from my end. I think it can be harmless, and I totally get what Rebecca was saying. I think people do come from an angle of curiosity, and they want to know, and I understand like some people genuinely just want to know, but the issue I have is that, and I think this is where a lot of people in our country are like, everybody's so sensitive and everybody's so PC, and they get, you can get in trouble for anything. And that's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is I think you should think 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 times before you just give your knee-jerk or whatever your instinctual response is verbally to somebody, because it can have a lot more impact on others if we want to make this genuinely want to make this country a better place. And the example I'm going to use is one of the teachers or aides or somebody at my grade school. And I was a little kid, and we went to the fall Halloween fling, whatever you want to call it. And my mom told my partner, she was over at my parents' house one day, and my mom told her this story, and I totally forgot about it. But when I was a little kid, I was in like 1st grade, and they were doing painting, and the lady said, oh my gosh, this paint will look so good. And then she did, and she's like, this paint looks so good on your brown skin. And when I left, I was like, Mom, I have brown skin. Like, I didn't know, I didn't realize. And so it was one adult verbally pointing out that I had different color skin. And in 1st grade, you're just, you're oblivious. And then that's the start of it. And that's where I'm like, wow, my skin's different than somebody that has lighter skin, and this person thought it was worth pointing out, right? She didn't say it necessarily in a bad way, but it's just like saying to somebody like, you're super skinny. Why say it? Why would you say that? I would never walk in a room and be like, oh my gosh, you're so skinny. What good would that do, right? I have to think once or twice or 3 times or 5 times before I'm like, I think it's probably better if I keep somebody's body image comments to myself than say them out loud, right? And the same thing for asking these questions or making references to somebody's decoration. So totally get what you're saying, Aaron. It's like, it's hard to and I'm not combative. I commend you on that. I wish I was more abrasive and more of a sort of contrarian to people, because I've let people just do what they want too often. And so it comes back to like, man, I wish I would have just sort of pushed back on that at a certain point.
It's not always all it's cracked up to be.
I like it. I like it though. I'm jealous. See, when you don't have that characteristic, you want it, and I want it. So any other input? Any other input from anyone?
Yeah, no, it's hard to keep my mouth shut. These are like,
sure, please do.
Such awesome points that you're making. These are the topics I cover in my courses, and try to get students engaged, and trying to emphasize like the impact that phenotype has on others' perceptions, and the way that when you're not from a phenotype other than like white skin. But I love the comparisons you're making. Okay, well, let's talk about, are you thin?
Sure.
It's fascinating because being in I learned Spanish as a 2nd language, so it's very obvious that I'm not from a certain place. But wherever I go, they always ask me if I'm from some other place, because right? But it's endearing. Like they just want, oh wow, are you Cuban or Dominican or I'll say words, oh, are you Mexican if I'm in, Caribbean places or Spain or whatever. But Spanish is, it's a colonial language. So there are many phenotypes. And so people, they don't look at me in terms of being white. They're hearing the language, right? And and there's a lot of stuff out on that. But here, if somebody who doesn't speak Spanish, they hear me speaking Spanish, it's like, are you Mexican? Like, it's just fascinating, right? Or if I'm at a carne asada or something with a group of folks from Mexican heritage and I'm speaking, and it's always painful when they'll point to like one of the younger cousins. They're like, see, even this white dude can speak Spanish. Why don't you speak Spanish? And so, they're
Wow.
saying that in Spanish, and it's like, or I still teach like, Spanish 101 at the community college. And when I hear somebody, a student look at a Latino student and say, how do you not know this? Aren't you Mexican? Like I snap on them.
Yeah, of
And
course.
so there's this component of, our identity where language is so deeply ingrained that's like they see you, but they also hear you, right?
Right.
And I don't know like if that's happened to you where they're like, oh, you're Pakistani, do you speak Urdu or what
Yeah.
language you speak? You're like, I speak English, man. Like
Yeah.
and that's what I do for a living is work in
Sure.
that world. So it's always on my mind.
Yeah,
But
no, you're
that's
impressive. To even know what Urdu is, you impressed me, Eric. Great work there. I think my response would be if it's out of your control, if you're born into it, then you should be able to self-identify, right? And if it's a preference, if it's an attitude, like if you like vanilla ice cream or chocolate, then let's talk about it. Like that's okay to discuss. That's okay to ask. It's okay to be sort of intrusive about your favorite flavor of ice cream. I would just throw it out there. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. But I think that's we immediately get to this hierarchy and competition power dynamic, and it's subconscious, right? It's not conscious act, it's a subconscious act, but it's how can I create a power dynamic with this? That's why we don't discuss income, because if I knew how much all my friends group made, I would probably think about it all the time and be like, gosh, they make more than me, like what am I doing wrong? And I need to know. So like we don't even bring it up, right? So that's why it's just not touched. So I think the same thing happens with these topics of we're trying to figure out where the belongingness is and if ours is higher than the other person in this case. And I think that's where I get into the language thing with Eric. It's if my Urdu is tutti putti, which in Urdu means it's crappy, then people are like, oh, you speak crappy Urdu, you're very Americanized. I've heard that a lot, and I do almost lose it, and I say, excuse me, because it's subjective, and nobody has the sliding scale of like how Pakistani you are, how good your Spanish is, right? Somebody thinks they're in charge of that, but it's subjective. So that's where we get into the hard part of we really need to make a push to self-identify. In my opinion, there should be a box, a government box or a job application box that has an open section, and it should allow you to put your own identification of your ethnicity, etc. And that's where I'm trying to get to, is that those things you should be able to you shouldn't have to be closed into a category or ask the question and forced to respond if you don't want to.
well, so I just want to interject because you have
Yeah.
kids and you went through this process and you don't have to
Yes.
say what you did, but
Sure.
when my daughter was born, that everything that process is a zoo, right? But at some point the nurses come in with that clipboard with all the paperwork for them to get their social security registered. Yep. And all that, and you got to do all the race and ethnicity. And I just put, it says, what's the race? And, her mom was born in Brazil. So I just put Brazilian, and then we got to ethnicity. And I drew a big circle and an arrow back up. And her mom was freaking out, and they're going to just freak out. And I'm like, no, I'm thinking of the dude processing all the numbers and looking at that going, what, and then I walk out in the hall and it's like 2 a.m. and they didn't know it was me. And I hear the 2 nurses behind the counter going, well, what is she? The mom was born in Brazil. Is she like Hispanic, Latino? Is she an up? And it was fascinating to hear that conversation. And so I sat there filling up my cup like 4 times with water.
That makes my day.
Listening. And so that's why it was after that they sent the papers. I'm like, you know what? This is, you know,
That makes my day.
those categories. Or
We
even
had-
with Asian, like I teach
Yeah.
my students, I'm like, all right, you got all these categories. What's the biggest country land-wise in Asia? And it's Russia. And so when I have students who are
Yep.
Russian, I'm like, are you Asian? They're like, no. Well, your country's in Asia. Like,
I just
so just
talked
to
about
play
this.
with all that stuff is a lot of fun. But sorry,
100%.
don't mean to take over. This
No,
is
no. Go ahead, Jessica. Jump in.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I'm excited to maybe I'm an over planner. I tell all my students I'm a chronic over planner. So there's a lot that I want to kind of throw on the table too, just again, like kind of adding the CAST framework here too, because I think where race is like woefully insufficient, as we have all talked about, right? As like a container for our complex experiences and just the, you know, the extreme diversity within countries, to say little of among countries, right? So that's why you know, this book that I'll introduce, maybe I'll start sharing my screen again, I think can be helpful. So, and I'd love to kind of, you know, kind of continue thinking about some of these threads. There were so many times I wanted to like jump in and be like, oh, I have a story about that. And hopefully we'll have some time at the end also just kind of like for some open discussion. But yeah, so this book, Cast, came out in 2020. I remember reading it, you know, kind of the height of the pandemic. And it's by Isabel Wilkerson, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. She worked for the New York Times for a number of years. Her book that won the Pulitzer Prize is called The Warmth of Other Suns. And it was about the Great Migration, also a really beautiful, powerful book. And in this project, she's essentially trying to kind of like peel back race to be like, what's underneath race? And to answer this question, she traveled extensively throughout India, where I think if you know of a caste system, that's probably the one that you're familiar with. But she talks a little bit about kind of like the origins of caste there, but then also looks at the caste infrastructure of Nazi Germany. And she talks about the caste infrastructure of the United States and looks at ways, like kind of common themes among each of these regimes and areas, right? This is just a really beautiful quote from the book where she's kind of laying out how she sees caste and race as intertwined. She says, caste and race are neither synonymous nor mutually exclusive. They can and do coexist in the same culture and serve to reinforce each other. Race in the United States is the visible agent of the unseen force of caste. Caste is the bones, race the skin. Race is what we can see, the physical traits that have been given arbitrary meaning and become shorthand for who a person is. Caste is the powerful infrastructure that holds each group in its place. So I have a movie. Imran, do we want to, I know you haven't even seen this movie. It is kind of like more information, or should we skip it in the interest of time? What do you think?
It's up to you. I mean, you can always email it out with it's with the slide deck. It's up to you. It doesn't matter to me.
Okay, maybe we'll watch like half of it.
Sure.
Okay, just to kind of give you a flavor again, kind of more context for the book itself.
Did you share sound when you did the share screen?
The focus on Black
I think I did. Can you all hear this?
Lives Matter remains, of course, one of the biggest subjects in the national conversation right now. A new book looks at how hierarchy and class are very intertwined in the way race and racism plays out in America. Jeffrey Brown talks to author Isabel Wilkerson. It's part of our ongoing arts and culture coverage, Canvas.
In 1959, Martin Luther King Jr., visiting India and seeing its caste system, realized he was a kind of untouchable in his own land. It's one of many stories told in the new book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, which asks us to see our country in a new way.
I really was looking to better understand the very long-standing origins of divisions in our country. You know, the era in which we live, this era of upheaval, really requires and calls for new language, new ways of seeing one another, new ways of understanding how we interconnect, and also what we've inherited as a country and as a people.
Isabel Wilkerson is a former Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with the New York Times and author of The Warmth of Other Suns, a history of the great migration of African Americans out of the South. Working on that book, she came to see something deeply embedded in American culture, even beyond race.
The word racism seemed inadequate to capture the full effect and total experience of being in a world in which every single thing that you could and could not do was based upon what you look like, a world in which everyone was in some ways consigned to preconceived notions as to who should be where, and people had to be careful to stay in their place or it mean their very lives.
Wilkerson looks to India, where we're used to seeing caste, and to Germany, where the Nazis created a racial hierarchy that formalized persecution and ultimately genocide. Drawing on the works of past anthropologists and historians, she reveals America's own insidious and artificial caste system, a strict hierarchy with rules that set in place both privilege and privation. You write of caste as the, quote, infrastructure of our divisions. Now, in what ways does caste help us think about what's going on in American history and now?
The word caste is a reminder of an infrastructure beneath something that something that's larger. It's something that sits beneath the foundation. It is the foundation, the framework for how people interact with one another. And so I have come to believe that caste, the infrastructure, the hierarchies that we often don't see, the bones of a thing. I think of caste as the bones and race as the skin. And that is a way to see that race is used or has been used historically as the cue, as the signal, as the indicator of where an individual fits in the pre-existing hierarchy that had been created from the time of colonial era America.
Slavery from the beginning manifests that hierarchy, one life worth more than another. But Wilkerson sees a continuity, waves of European immigrants arriving in this country and, in a sense, learning they are white, and therefore above those who aren't.
When you're in a caste system, a hierarchy, everyone is affected by it. It's about the investment in the hierarchy, how one moves about in a hierarchy. And the insidious thing about such a hierarchy is it's something that we don't see. Again, bones versus skin. You can see the skin, you can see the outward manifestations, but you don't often see those the unseen inputs and triggers and assumptions, the unconscious biases that pervade society that are there below the surface of consciousness, that have been ways that everyone has been socialized to know and recognize who is very likely to be in positions of power, who is likely to be poor, who is likely to be on the margins,
who is likely to sit in a position of power.
We'll pause it there. I think that gives you a sense. Yes. Okay. That gives you maybe a sense of kind of the project, and it's a admittedly enormous project, right? To think about caste and how it's manifesting not only in the US, but also kind of what are the common threads with India and even with Nazi Germany. So I'm going to share right now just an excerpt from this book. It's one that, I kept thinking about it years ago when I first read this book, and it has never left my mind. I think it's just so fascinating. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in the chat. So since there's only 6 of us on the call, I think we'll all just kind of stay in the same room. But I'd love you to take maybe 5 or so minutes just to read through this excerpt from Isabel Wilkerson's book. And then we'll come back together and we'll think about how we see race versus ethnicity, identity, belonging, ethnocentrism kind of at work within this excerpt.
So you just want to take 5 minutes and then plug back in?
Yeah, just 5 minutes, and then I'll call us back. I'll watch the time.
Cool.
into the chat, but really just I'd love to know kind of how you're seeing maybe some threads of our conversation thus far in this anecdote.
I had it happen to me at 2 college campuses that I've taught, where somebody came in to either troubleshoot, or somebody came in, maybe one time I needed the door unlocked, and they were like, I need the professor, and I was like, that's me. And then just this chasing tail conversation, like not as severe as what she experienced, but yeah, I've been there with that maybe they were looking for somebody who's more of a cardboard cutout for teaching a college class, and took some convincing, and or maybe they ask everybody for their IDs. I don't know. But yeah, so that was my experience, similar to what she experienced, but that was just, yeah, outrageous.
Put my phone over, and I'm all disoriented. There's a story that comes to mind reading that, where it's like someone's idea of the container, like where I should be on a shelf, just really did not match up. And it was like maybe a little bit more overt even. I just remember I was on a road trip with my mom and my stepdad down to visit our abuelita in California. And I was like 9 at the time, maybe 8. And we like went to a gas station to get gas, and we walked in, and the man who was behind the counter was like, I don't speak Spanish. Like, he was like gesturing at the door. He's like, I don't speak Spanish. And I was like, I don't either. It's great, like crazy. Twins.
What a coincidence.
And then he was like, well, we don't take food stamps. And I was like, I don't even know what that is, And then I'm like looking at my mom and my stepdad, and they're both like angry, obviously. And I'm just like really confused at this interaction. And then I just remember my stepdad just like opening his wallet, and he just pulls out like 20s, and he was like, you cash? And he was like, we don't take bills that big. You're gonna have to go somewhere else. And then we just left. And I had no clue what happened. And it wasn't until years later I looked back on that, and I was like, oh, that was like super racist. That was really messed up. But just really interesting. Yeah, like the second that you walk in somewhere, and my stepdad, he's from El Salvador. And so and he has like a perceivable accent. And so I think that it's just really interesting to look back on and realize that like all the check marks this person was like looking at the second we walked through the door, and how all of those belonged somewhere that wasn't his space. So yeah, what is that?
Yeah, so it was like there were like kind of the racial characteristics, right, that then linked in his mind to language, linked in his mind to poverty, right? Like, and I think it's helpful to kind of like tease those out, right? Kind of all of this sort of like, I don't know, clump of meaning that we associate with various like racial groups, right? That says something about language and class. And also that is horrifying. And I've never heard that story before. And I'm so sorry, sis.
So
I didn't know you hadn't heard it. Sorry.
I appreciate you. I appreciate you sharing that. And when I get in these discussions with students, it's heartbreaking to hear how many of them share similar stories. It's being profiled, and it just reminds me that the movie Crash. That was an older movie. But the other day, I went into a gas station, Maverick gas station. It's a big, convenience mart or whatever. And I was gonna go buy gas, and I saw right before me these 2 young Latina girls walk in, and they're probably middle school, and they took a left for the chips and all that. And I saw somebody from behind the counter immediately go over and start monitoring, and I was like, oh man, just another case. And then while I paid for my gas, I was leaving, and she had the one gal emptying out her backpack. And the gal pulled out chips and some Red Bulls that she had lifted, and her friend bailed. And I was like, oh man, it's like, I didn't intervene because the gal was shoplifting. And it was just like, of the 99% that don't do it, you catch one, and then all of them, students like that you see are those targets, and reinforce those stereotypes. Or it's the white middle school kids that come in that they don't profile, that roll out with a haul, and so those things are just horrible. And they just perpetuate those stereotypes, which that was my reference to the movie Crash. But that was just a couple days ago, and I went from oh man, they're profiling them, and you had to be the ones coming here and do that, and now everybody's on you. It's heartbreaking, you know.
That's a great example.
So my partner is from Wisconsin, very white. And then one time I went to the grocery store with my mother-in-law, and I'm pretty sure the cashier thought I was adopted. Yeah. So
What gave you that sense? I mean, yeah.
Yeah, it was because it was just me and her, and we were checking and going through, and then the cashier had this moment to be like, are you together, kind of a situation. And then my mother having to like explain, it's like, this is my daughter-in-law. Like, if you need to help connecting why these two people are standing next to each other. I was like,
right.
Yeah, it's just the assumption that is, yeah, it's
Well, and they
Absolutely.
outwardly said that too. So I had an incident when I first got married. My wife was from Brazil, and I went to some store to buy her something, and it's like, yeah, my wife's from Brazil, and blah blah blah. I want to get this, and she's like, and the woman just straight up said, "Oh, mail order bride." And I look at her, and I was like, yeah, I got half off since she's South American. I mean, but I'm coming from a a privileged background. I can get away with that stuff. But I was like, the audacity of that woman. Had I, now I would have been, no, why do you say that? But there are those weird moments where it's like, is this really happening? Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing these stories. I mean, and I know I've been pushing this, and now I'm going to get into like why, but like I think caste has a lot to do with this. So I'm going to kind of run through some of the commonalities among those caste systems, just because I think it'll give us a little more of a handle on, again, Wilkerson's argument, but also hopefully be helpful just in terms of like processing these experiences that we are sharing, right? Because again, I think race, and I don't want to like, I guess, denounce or dilute the power of like naming racism for sure. But I also, again, I think it's interesting to kind of like pick apart like, well, what's sort of beneath that? So like Rebecca's example, right, of like being with a white woman in a supermarket, like you're together, and the cashier just like not being able to compute why two people from what she presumes to be like different groups would be together, right? Like that is puzzling. And she's like, I need the explanation for this because that otherwise does not happen. And so anyway, like these are the 8 pillars of caste. Again, Wilkerson's talking about the US, especially chattel slavery within the US, the Nazi regime in Germany, and also India. And these are kind of all the pieces that are common across these. And today we're just going to talk about the first 5, because I think those are most relevant to questions of like, what are you? Where are you from? So divine will and the laws of nature, heritability, endogamy, purity versus pollution, and occupational hierarchy. I'm going to talk through these just so we're kind of on the same page about what she means. So in all of these places, there is a sacred text that kind of outlines and sort of reifies a divide between groups of people. So in the sacred Hindu text called the Manu, there are 4 varnas, or kind of divisions of mankind. And beyond those 4 varnas, and within those, there are castes and subcastes. But there are people who are not even included in those varnas. Those are the untouchables. Today we call them the Dalits, but literally they are outcasts. That's where the word outcast comes from, right? Like being beyond the caste system, so far away, so untouchable, we're not even like naming your presence. From a kind of Christian perspective, and I'm not up to date on all my Bible stuff, so I'm sure there are folks here who could like lend more of a more detail. But essentially, what I gather from the text is that Noah, as we know, Noah's Ark. Maybe some of us know that story. He had 3 sons, and thanks so much, Rebecca. Thanks for joining us. But he had 3 sons, and one of his sons witnessed him after a drunken I don't know, tear. He was like naked laying down, Ham witnessed that and told his brothers, and this was like a big, this is, I don't know, a tension, a taboo, a no-no to like look at your father's nakedness. And the good brothers like got a cloth and like backed into the room where Noah was in order to cover him up so that they wouldn't see his nakedness. But it got back to Noah that Ham had seen his nakedness. And so Noah cursed all of Ham's offspring, saying, "The lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers." So the idea being here that like there are these sacred texts that from, that lay out a justification for separating people and why some people, have easier lives, are higher up on the hierarchy, and why some are lower. So the second big pillar is heritability, which I think is really interesting. So in India, the caste system works that you inherit it from your father. But in the US, especially like during times of chattel slavery, caste was inherited from the mother, which, I was thinking like, that's interesting. That feels like vaguely matriarchal. And I know that our society is deeply patriarchal. But the reason why caste was inherited from the mother was because any child born to an enslaved woman that was the product of rape, let's say by the slaveholder, would also be considered Black, right? Would also be considered a slave. So there wasn't like an incentive. It was almost an incentive to continue sexual violence, right? Because any offspring thereof would add to a slaveholder's ownings, as awful as that is. So I thought that was kind of an interesting demarcation. And we see this in all different kinds of ways, like one drop rules in South Africa, where the population, there was kind of a swap where it was like a white minority and a Black majority. They have their own system where rather than being like one drop and you are considered Black, like in the US, like if you were mixed, they have their own category that's higher up, that's viewed as like, a step up the ladder from being a Black African, but not quite as high as, the Afrikaners or the English folks who live there. So that's kind of the second pillar there, heritability. And I'm just running through these again so we can kind of get some language, some thinking. Endogamy, or restricting marriage to people within the same caste. As Wilkerson notes, the framers of the American caste system worked really hard to make sure that castes would remain separate, to seal off bloodlines. And what this does, it does a lot of things, but one of the primary purposes or outcomes is that it means if you're only kind of marrying people that are within the same caste, you will not encounter people in a meaningful way that belong to other castes, right? You will have less of a personal stake in their happiness, in their fulfillment, in their well-being, again, because we're sealing off these quote unquote bloodlines. Some of us might know this, but it was illegal in the United States for a very long time to marry someone interracially or to have a mixed marriage. And yeah, so at one time, 41 out of 50 states outlawed intermarriage, and Alabama was the last state to repeal its endogamy law in 2000. And extra fun fact, when it was repealed, there were still 40% of voters that wanted to keep it on the books. So Wilkerson also talks about this idea, again, common to all of these caste systems, this idea of purity versus pollution, again, tied up with endogamy, right? Like keeping bloodlines, quote unquote, pure. And she notes that in all of these regimes, like they were obsessed, like the people in power were obsessed with this idea of purity, raising it to a high, if absurdist art, she says. So I think when we think about Jim Crow in the United States, we probably have a sense of like, different water fountains, for instance, different schools. But I didn't realize until reading the book that it went far beyond that. The like school books, when they were being stored over the summer, they could not be, like the school books for white children and the school books for Black children could not be stored together. Bed sheets for Black prisoners had to be stored elsewhere, away from the bed sheets for white prisoners. If you were Black and you died in a hospital, a public hospital, they had to move your body somewhere else separate because it could not exist in a public hospital. Also really common throughout all these regimes was this idea of the sanctity of water, like kind of this obsession with water and this fear that someone from the lower caste, should they be in the same body of water as people from higher castes, would pollute the water. So in Nazi Germany, for instance, one of the first things that the Nazis implemented was a rule around beaches. So even though in parts of Germany where like Jews owned beach houses, they were not allowed to go onto the beach or swim in the sea. So that was kind of one of the first early moves by the Nazi regime. We can think about public pools in the quote unquote public pools in the United States around the era of Jim Crow. So that bottom photo there is a group of Black integrationists in Florida. They're in a pool, and that is the hotel manager pouring acid into the pool. This is from 1964. We know of stories too, right, where if a Black person went into a public pool, either by mistake or trying to integrate, sometimes they would empty the pool and refill it with water. Sometimes they would pour cement in the pool afterwards and no one could use it, right? So again, this idea of purity versus pollution. I also just want to mention, I think it's really fascinating. And again, this is where like race can kind of fall short. So in the top picture here, this is a man named Takao Ozawa, and he was from Japan, but he had lived in the US for 20 years. And he petitioned all the way up to the Supreme Court in 1922 because he said, I should be considered white. Look at my skin. It is whiter. It is as white or whiter than other people here that you count as white. And the Supreme Court said, nah, not so fast, right? And so I think about him and his case because when we talk about races like just skin color, like Takao Ozawa has a point, right? I'm sure his skin was very fair, but that's not it, right? It's all of these other racial characteristics. There are stories in Wilkerson's book too of people coming from India who belonged to the higher castes and also petitioning to be considered white. And again, met both publicly and also legally with like, no. Like that's not how it works here, right? You're not, that doesn't make sense within our rather arbitrary caste system. All right, occupational hierarchy. I think this is the last one that we're going to talk about today and maybe kind of most relevant, but within all these caste systems, there is a very strict division of labor based on your place in the hierarchy. So Wilkerson talks about in India, your subcaste or your jati determines the occupation that your whole family fulfilled. And in the US, Black Americans were relegated to the dirtiest, most demeaning jobs. And their best hope was to teach or minister to or to provide healthcare to other people of the lower caste. And again, I think about this like in the story, in the anecdote that I shared, where it's like, again, this is part of that container that doesn't fit, right? Like coming from a caste perspective and thinking like to be a part of the lower caste means that you are also in more kind of service-oriented positions. That does cause confusion then when you are interviewed by a Black reporter for the New York Times, right? So I want to pause here, and maybe this is a good time to just kind of go back to the group. I'll introduce these questions and then I will stop the share. But now kind of thinking about those pillars of caste, and I know I ran through them pretty quickly, but where do we see caste showing up when we ask questions like, where are you from? Or what are you? I'll go ahead and stop my share and then maybe we can get into a conversation.
Well, I think Erin's driving, so it might be hard for her to reply, but I think the question that you posed at the beginning with, what'd you make last year? Or what was your tax bracket? It like socioeconomic status and racial categories, that's a huge component, right? Where you look at disproportionate rates of folks living in lower income areas and how that plays into all of it, right? Not just who they interact with and who their potential mates are or partners are for future relationships and continuing on. So that's a pseudo endogmous, setting that keeps perpetuating it. Lack of access then to schools is where, Jessica, I know we come at it, right? And so education levels, socioeconomic status, and those disproportionate rates of minoritized groups in certain circumstances. And then I was fascinated by Imran's, point about, well, how do we look at, the criminal system and recidivation and all those things play into that notion of a caste. And but it starts with, I mean, I went through grad school reading a lot of Edward Said and Orientalism and the othering and how that plays into our views of people that keep them in situations that perpetuate those concepts that you had on the slide. And then how do you break out of it? And then when folks are out of that situation, do they fall into that dominant view of the other, even with folks that phenotypically look the same or, ethnically or heritage wise, or come from a similar background? And so this is such a phenomenal way to present the topic, and what keeps a caste and a caste system in place. And the policy issues you're mentioning are, I mean, that's at the heart of it, right?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Eric. You're the best. I want to clone you and have you at all of our webinars. I think for me, the last thing I just want to jump in here, I wanted to remember to say today before we're done is institutionally, I believe, I don't want to speak for our politicians and all these different decades that they've been in DC, but there's a feeling that they fixed problems with the civil rights movement and some federal level policies that were passed, and clearly that has not fixed a lot of the cultural underlying issues of how we're going to create an equal playing field with things across the board. So the part of the reason why I think it's important to have these conversations is, I can even get better. I learned a lot from what Jessica was just talking about too, and I've even from all of our participants and you, Eric. But I think so that's great. We're learning, but I also think that this work needs to continue because we have, a state that was just yesterday basically that was hesitant to let people marry that were of different, skin colors and skin tones. And that's where the average person doesn't know that that's taking place and that people are still lobbying for that to happen. And so, yeah, and I think Jessica and I talked about this, and so it's in the recording. I think I'll say that from my parents, where they were born and raised for half their life, they were almost half their life. They came from a very rigid, very enforced caste system type culture where you would marry somebody, based on caste, like Jessica had reference in India and like Eric was saying, socioeconomics are connected to caste and connected to occupation, which was what one of your slides said. And so where you're born allows you to have access to more options. And then those options allow you to have access to different levels of people that could be potentially your romantic partner that you could reproduce. And so what they're trying to do is build populations of people from higher culture backgrounds and then keep the low culture backgrounds together. And so it's happening in other countries. And I think the difference is, and people are like, well, it's happening everywhere. Why do we talk about the United States like it's such a villain? Well, the whole concept of this country is to be free and open and welcoming for anybody who wants to be here. There's no national religion, there's no national language. but yet we're still here trying to create, systems and buckets and categories of people who are more and less important and more or less likely to have opportunities to succeed. So that's kind of just one of the underlying things I wanted to like throw in there as a part of our wrap up, is that it's ultra important to have these conversations, even whether it's over coffee with a friend or in this setting, or to play this video to a class or something, because there's people who constantly have to have context to why dialogue should continue and why should we continue lobbying for policies. And I saw a sign the other day of somebody who was frustrated about having to they were at a protest, a silent protest about women's reproductive rights, and the sign read like, I can't believe I'm still having to you know be in attendance at these for this topic because it's 2024. And so I think those dialogues and those things have to take place, because we have shown we can go backwards and lose progress. And so but yeah, Jessica, that was super educational, and I think that book is just brilliant in so many ways, and it creates the information that you presented creates such a good representation of kind of a lot of things that happen in our country for decades, and it gives a lot of context to it, and so it's really great.
No,
Right.
thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, basically, like, I was hoping, for us all to kind of have some time to think about. And as we said at the start, right, often people will be just like, I ask these questions because I'm curious. But I think that our curiosity is rooted in caste, right? I think our curiosity is rooted in, like, because it's a complex combination of things, right? It's like, what language are you speaking? Where are you? How are you dressed? Right? Kind of all this whole constellation. And if we can't figure out, like, subconsciously which caste we think this person is in, I think that's when the question is like, well, where are you from? Or like, what
Yeah.
are you?
Yeah.
I think that's, and again, like, I don't think that that's like top level, top of mind for people, but I think that's where it's rooted. Do you want me to show your slide about how can we disrupt real quick?
I just
Oh,
want
go
to
ahead.
mention one thing, because
Yes.
I'm enjoying the focus on how policies really structure an environment for creating that architecture of they're perpetuating caste systems or not. But even like in Washington, which is a pretty progressive state, you still have policies that have a benevolent orientation but are uninformed. So one that I've been bumping up against too is this emphasis on making school districts provide dual credit options where high school students can receive college credit, right? For either college in the high school or running start, and pressing that. And then schools look good if they're doing it. And when in reality, a lot of the credits that students receive, they don't count towards a degree. And for the students who rely on financial aid, which are students from lower SES groups, and usually first gen students, they're not aware of the implications of taking random college credits as a high school student. And then when they get into a college and university setting, their financial aid eligibility, it's 150% of a degree, right? So it runs out, and then they have to pay the last year and a half of their degree, which folks in that situation can't do, and they can't leverage, financial aid loans. And so even policies like that, sometimes they're meant to say, no, we recognize that these communities are underrepresented and have lower rates of higher education. So we're going to make sure they get a ton of credit, when in reality, it hurts them. And so those types of policies need to be connected with these discussions in bigger ways, that we understand, okay, you're doing it because of this, but what are the actual repercussions of this type of thing? And so, Imran, I'm glad you really pointed out that policy making structure and how it impacts people moving forward.
I think you should run. Need more people like you. Jessica, to answer your question, I don't know. We have to show the slide. You can if you want. It's just really
Maybe
the
we just
last
talk
thing.
through it. Yeah.
Yeah, the last thing is just really to advocate and be an ally, I think is the biggest takeaway. I think for me, being a high school kid who was, called a camel jockey that day, whatever day it was. And I think that day, in a hypothetical scenario of a kid who's in that situation, who's me, doesn't have the ability to defend myself, speak for myself. At that point, I feel like super minimized to like 0%, no belongingness, everything opposite of kind of what we've been talking about in this call. So I think the advocate argument for me is we need to start, another thing I would like to start doing more, and maybe the next round and this year, next year's, is really having more conversations around what it means to be an advocate and an ally, and why it's similar to the Good Samaritan law. The Good Samaritan law, everybody knows that, where you could face jail time if you don't call 911 and you don't help somebody who is in need of help, right? And you're the only one that can do that, who heard that or saw that. And in a situation where somebody's being bullied or there's hate speech and things like that, which happened to me many times growing up, there just wasn't anybody who stood up and advocated for me on my behalf verbally, or went to somebody in a position of authority and said, this, what I'm hearing people say to Imran is wrong, and we need to do something about it. And obviously I'm not going to do that, because I feel like I need to go run and hide. And then if I come back and tell on somebody, that's just going to make it worse. In high school, we know how that is. But if you're the third party and you aren't in that vulnerable position, and you're somebody who noticed it and it's wrong, then you are in a great position, because you're not in a position to be bullied anymore, and you didn't face the act, and you weren't the person who was bullying. You're the person who's trying to advocate and again, it's just kind of metaphorical, but pump that person back full of confidence and power. And so I think my message is, and it came from a school district meeting I was in last week, and our district has a big, huge handbook on hate speech and bullying and all the stuff I'm talking about. And the superintendent went over this with me, and I said, well, this is great, but you talk about the bullier and the victim and how we want to handle that and what they should do, but you don't talk about the advocate or the third party. And I told her a couple stories about what I faced, and she was like, it's a great point. And I said, we need to start telling high school students, in this case, she was talking about the high school, it's in our district, and that it's cool to be an advocate, and empower those third parties that are on the outside looking in or observing it, to say, I'm going to do something to stop this, or I'm going to do something to embarrass the bullier so that they don't ever do that again, and so they know it's wrong. So anyway, I don't know if that's really all we had, Jessica, on that slide, but I think
no, totally.
But go ahead.
Yeah. Well, no, and I mean the other things that I think even were brought up earlier, like Rebecca, she had an idea that was already like on our slides, which is like, you can turn it around, right? If you are asked, like, where are you from? You could also like say, well, where are you from? Like, I'm curious. Or if you're the bystander, it's a group of people and one person's being targeted, you could, do a micro affirmation. Like, that could be a difficult question for some folks, like, because I think like for a lot of us, right, we're in situations where we see microaggressions maybe more than we see like macroaggressions. So kind of linguistically just kind of inserting ourselves and like, again, turning the question back, or verbally saying that could be a tough question. How about we lead with something else if it's an icebreaker or whatever it is, right?
Redirecting it.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I joke with people and I was joking with Jessica about this kind of on our drive, was like, it's like me asking, random, just casually, like, what's your sexual orientation? And thinking that that's going to be a fine question to lead with. And I think that would be sort of the micro redirect, is somebody asks where you're from or about your parents' immigration story, which has happened to me so many times. When did your dad come here? When did your parents come here? Oh my gosh, so many times. It brings back traumatic memories. But it'd be like me turning around, or somebody saying like, hey, what's your sexual orientation? Why don't you tell us that before Imran tells you his parents' immigration story? And so I think that's, all joking aside, seriously though, that's like what we have to do to people sometimes as the advocate. Imran can't do that. I can't turn around and say that, because they're like, oh, what's your problem? Why are you getting all mad about this? The third party can say, hey, before Imran tells you that, why don't you tell us about your sexual orientation? And if you've ever experimented, and if you like both, that's cool. Let's talk about it. Then Imran will tell you about his parents and grandparents' immigration story. Totally, you know? And then I can say, yeah, I mean, I feel like it's on the same level. It's a personal thing for me. Let's talk about a personal thing for you, and then I'll equal you, after that. So I think that's kind of the other route I take, is try to create comparison where people can often relate to something that's intrusive or uncomfortable in a way that they've never had to face the where are you from ethnicity question, because they may be European American. And I did a talk that Jessica knows about, that where I concentrated on the fact that European American is not ever stated. It's just not a thing, and it should be. If we're going to be Pakistani American or Mexican American or whatever it is, Brazilian American, like your partner might refer to herself Eric, then let's have European American. Why not? So those are the things that I would say would help advocate, and that's really the underlying solution if we have one. And it's not like a thing that we can just push a button and it's going to fix it, but over time we can get to a point where there's more people advocating and diminishing the voices of the people who are trying to create those power dynamics and differentials. Then I think then one conversation at a time will definitely get somewhere.
Absolutely. Well, we're bumping up against time here. I think it's been a phenomenal conversation. I kind of like the more intimate, smaller group. I think it produced a lot of really interesting points, and that will be very helpful for those who watch the video moving forward.
Thank you for having
so much,
us.
Eric. And also Imran, Ramadan Mubarak.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you, everybody. Yeah, sorry I was yawning. It's because I don't have my afternoon espresso shots.
the blood sugar's
Sorry
low.
about that. So,
Well, thank you very much. This has been
Thank
more
you.
than I've been looking forward to this one since last summer, and it's more than I even expected. So
Awesome.
So Jessica and Imran, go ahead and hang out for a few minutes afterwards. So Natalia and Aaron, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And